Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the whole workflow of modeling, unwrapping, baking and texturing this simple stylized flower in 3ds Max and Substance Painter. This plant model has a pretty low polygon count, coming in at around 141 polygons. This makes it suitable for most PC indie games, especially if we are primarily looking at it from above. However, for some mobile platforms, you might want to consider further optimization. I begin by modeling the filament of the flower. The high poly element will be baked down to a simple sphere, so we can add as much detail as we like without impacting the final polygon count of our low poly model. To create the base structure, I start by building an organic shaped cylinder and filling it with some kind of thick tendril. I then offset the center of the shape and duplicate it, rotating the copies to form a circular arrangement. While you can introduce subtle variations by deforming each cylinder individually to break the perfect symmetry, I opted to maintain a more uniform look for this particular model. At this stage we can use as many iterations of NURMS modeling or TurboSmooth as we want, it won't affect our final polycount. Next I fill the center of my composition with a simple sphere. And there you have it, the filament is complete. Even if you ultimately decide not to use a normal map, you can still benefit from the baking process. Bake the high poly filament to a low poly sphere, and then paint the resulting texture in Substance Painter. While you might not use the baked normals in the final render, the painting process will often introduce subtle details and variations that can be effectively added to enhance the visual appeal of the low poly sphere. The thing you see right now isn't our low poly hemisphere yet. I simply add the base for our filament that will eventually get probulined to our tendril cylinders. It may be a good idea to deform our filaments or even the hemisphere at this point. I chose not to do it. Next I create petals. I start off by making a circle with 40 sides, which offers us 8 polygons for each of our 5 petals. Then I delete unused polygons and create the initial shape of my petal by moving vertices manually while having edge constraint function enabled. I add some inner geometry and then lift up the petal's external borders slightly to give it some volume. Also I raise its tip slightly so it receives a nice curve. Finally, I lower and extrude its middle part to give it a central line of some sort. We can always turbo-smooth our petals, as they won't affect our final poly count in any way. After I'm done with editing geometry manually, I add some thickness to my petals by using the shell modifier and another layer of turbo-smooth. We want to make our petals thick enough for them to have a proper stylized look. After one petal is complete, it is already centered to the center of our filament. We can simply rotate its copies by 72 degrees. If you wanted to have 6 petals, you should have created a cylinder with 48 sides and rotate copies by 60 degrees obviously. At this stage you can play around with some details, deforming some petals, bending them slightly, or even changing their rotation angles. The only thing you want to avoid here are petal intersections, those won't look good once we bake them. Next I add the low poly hemisphere to my model. It's crucial to position it relatively close to the high poly details geometry to ensure accurate baking of the normal and other maps. Make sure to trim down its poly count as hard as you can, but also avoid making it too edgy. After all, we'll have to paint some details on it. I use my central hemisphere to create some external parts of geometry that will host baked petals. Make sure not to overextend with the amount of side edges and also the amount of its support edges. The lower hemisphere shall be aligned to petals and shall stay relatively close to them so they can get baked properly. This is the biggest detail of our flower, so I want it to be smooth. This is why I add one extra support edge by using the Insert Edge Loop tool while holding the Shift key. I add a simple UV unwrap to my hemispheres in order to create a test bake and see how my petals behave. If everything is fine, I can proceed with modeling. To streamline the workflow, I combine all high poly objects using a Boolean operation. I then assign them a consistent naming convention, mirroring the name of the low poly hemisphere combo, but with a distinct suffix to differentiate them. Then I perform a test bake. I use a 1K as a UV map, my subsampling is set to 16. I disable the ID section and set the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs. I move my distance sliders a bit till I don't see some red elements. It doesn't guarantee anything, and normally you have to do several bakes with different settings before you actually get a decent one. Finally, I get some settings that are just right. This is the bake I get. After I'm satisfied with my bake and know that I may leave the flower the way it is, I start modeling its stem, side petals and leaves. The stem shall have no more than 5 sides. I've decided to stick to 4. You may start by creating a high poly stem and then use the dot loop and ring select tools to collapse unnecessary edges on its copy. This way you will get 2 stems that share the same curve. The curve itself is created with the help of the FFD 4x4 modifier. Make sure to trim down the amount of support edges of your low poly stem and add some support edges to your high poly stem for it to look smooth. We aren't attaching our low poly stem to the flower, leaves or anything else to preserve our poly count. This adds some obvious limitations. For example, we shall only use this flower in projects where we will observe it from above. This allows us to remove any unnecessary polygons from some regions of the flower that won't be visible by viewers. For example, top parts of the stem will get blocked from side by petals. Next thing I do is model some side petals and leaves. Once again, their polycount doesn't matter at all, so you can literally use any amounts of turbo smooth. The leaf is made by applying an FFD modifier to the petal we have just created. I create some low poly planes below my leaf and side petal, ensuring the fact they intersect properly. Those will become our low poly leaves once we add a cutout map. In order to increase the chance of a good bake, make sure your low poly planes are slightly bigger than your leaves. Next, I unwrap everything. The process is pretty straightforward here. Normally you want to group this plant with some other objects in order to utilize your available UV space more efficiently. 1K is a little bit too much for a single flower like this one, and I only stick to it for demo purposes. Still, I do my best to fill up the available UV space as much as possible. Also remember that our filament sphere will get a really high amount of delicate details, so we want to increase the size of the corresponding UV chuck. Next, I check if everything gets baked fine and we don't have some weird artifacts. Once again, I set my resolution to 1K, subsampling to 16, put the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs and disable the ID section. As you can see, everything looks just fine. In order to create a cutout map, I rebake only my normals map by setting the amount of rays to 0. I then export my resulting map to Photoshop, go to its blending options and apply a black color overlay to it. Then I combine it to the white layer below it and export the mask to Substance Painter. In Substance Painter, I switch my shader to the one that has alpha blending, add an opacity channel to my flower, give it a maximum opacity, mask the opacity layer, and fill it with the mask I've created in Photoshop. I prefer to start texturing natural objects by using a default Creature Skin Green Smooth Smart material. I create 2 copies of it, give them a different tint, mask the second one, and apply a linear gradient to the flower's stem. Both layers are placed into a stem folder, which is masked and only applied to my flower's stem by using the polygon fill tool. If you know the color of your landscape, it may be nice to incorporate it into the bottom part of the stem, so they blend perfectly when you place the flower. For the petals, I use the same base material and experiment with the color settings within its layers. To further enhance the visual appeal, I add a new fill layer. On this new layer, I apply a circular gradient. By carefully positioning this gradient on the UV map, I can selectively brighten the tips of the petals, creating a more visually interesting and realistic effect. I hold the Shift key in order to constrain proportions of the gradient layer I added. If you want to optimize your flower even more and reduce the size of your texture maps, you may use a uniform roughness value for it, instead of creating a roughness map like I do. Such minor details may not even be visible in-game, but they are a huge source of potential optimization. I proceed to texturing the filament. I use 3 different copies of the Creature Skin Green Smooth Smart material to paint different elements of the filament. I mask each layer, apply a paint layer to it, and simply paint details over the baked geometry. This material even fills cavities with a different color the way we want it. I reduce the roughness of some delicate tendrils or whatever those things are called, and increase the roughness of surrounding elements to create some kind of contrast you may see in nature. I skip some monotonous parts of the video here, where I paint each of these elements. Since we are painting with fill layers, we retain control of all their settings, and may edit them at any stage of our texturing process. I prefer to give my models some placeholder colors and then bring them all together when I can see the whole picture. I use the same approach and the same modified Creature Skin Green Smooth Smart material to texture side petals and leaves. To subtly enhance the visual appeal of side petals, I added the fill layer and applied a subtle motion blur filter. This effect is barely noticeable, but it can create an illusion of movement or flow, adding a touch of dynamism to the overall appearance. We don't even have any visible UV seams on our model, so we can move back to 3ds Max. I remove all high poly pieces of my model to a separate file and move my leaves and side petals to their positions. Since they have some inner geometry, we can edit them, break symmetry, or play with their scales and rotation angles. Make sure to deform them and break those planes into more organic shapes. Also remember to group everything together and position your pivot point to the bottom part of the flower, placing it to 0, 0, 0 scene coordinates. And this is it. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.